Good evening. The divorce process can be one of the most emotionally trying times in a person's life. Many psychologists liken it to the process a person goes through in grief when they've lost a loved one. You go through the same stages of anger, bitterness, resentment, and then hopefully eventually acceptance. Combine that process with children and the fact that in America we are reaching nearly a 50% divorce rate, then what we have is a crisis with the American families. You're watching Access to Justice, and I'm attorney Delia Parker Mims. Today, we're going to discuss how to have a healthy divorce and hopefully be able to map out for you some strategies you can use to go through that process. And we are fortunate to have two of my most favorite people with us to discuss the divorce process, and they're experts in this field. Now, in addition to being my favorite people, the other thing they have in common is that they both have the distinction of being able to have the word honorable in their title. We have the Honorable Dianne Costa, former mayor of Highland Village, and we have the Honorable Dennise Garcia, the current sitting judge of the 303rd District Court, Family Court in Dallas County. I'm going to start with Dianne, and we'll talk a little bit about some of your experiences, but first, let's tell the viewers how we know each other. We go back a little bit. Is that correct? We do. We were both board members on the Denton County Child Protective Services Board.
Yes.
Now, one of my fondest memories of Dianne was during the time period when I was serving as president and I had to bring my daughter to the meeting. She was a baby, and you were kind enough to sit there and rock her because mommy duties don't ever stop.
Yes.
I really appreciated that. Helped us get through the process. Currently, you are the owner of Seema.
Yes.
Counseling, Education, Mediation Assistance.
Associates?
Associates,
Yes.
Okay. And that is in the city of Denton.
It is.
Okay. Tell the viewers a little bit about what Seema does.
Well, Seema is a collaborative process of education, counseling, mediation to empower families and individuals. And so we offer kind of like a one-stop place where they can come and have the needs met of their family. And so we've been in Denton for over 12 years, and we serve the community and the courts, and we're happy to do that.
Okay. So for the past 12 years, you've been in the trenches, and we'll talk about that a little further in the show of what it's like to be in the trenches of a divorce process. Now, Judge Garcia, you and I go back a little bit further
Right.
than the Honorable Dianne. We go back all the way to SMU. We were college students.
It's not that far back, though, right?
Okay, not that far back at all. We were probably a couple of sizes smaller, but just as cute. And one memory I have of you, actually a couple. The first one is we were both resident assistants,
Right.
and we were going to be in a talent show, we thought, and sing either the Beatles song or an Ike and Tina Turner song, but you correctly decided that we should not do that.
Well, I appreciate your memory about that, yes.
And since I've done a few karaoke since then, I think that probably was the best thing to do. Now, the other thing that I remember quite fondly of you, and I very much admire you for this, was that in college, you always spoke about wanting to be a family law attorney, and you always said you wanted to practice family law for a few years, and then you wanted to become a family district court judge.
Right.
And then you were able to do that. You set your eye on the target, and you achieved that. Tell the viewers a little bit about your experience as a family law attorney and subsequent judge.
Well, I knew really early on, like you said, that I really wanted to be in family court or involved in some way with families because, you know, I wanted to be a lawyer. Knew eventually I wanted to involve that skill set with being in politics. That's where the whole goal for being a judge came from. I witnessed family members go through, you know, the family court system and have some great difficulty in doing that. And as a result, I thought, you know, this is something that I could probably grow up and do, trying to help people get through the system and find their way and navigate their way through a system that, you know, where people need a lot of help and where it touches them most intimately with their families and, you know, conflicts between their families and their relationships with their kids. My experience has been, you know, 10 years as a private attorney and now 10 years on the bench. You know, it's a difficult practice. I mean, you've done some family law, you understand how difficult it can be, where you hope to achieve the greatest good for individuals, but very often end up in a place where people are hurt the most.
Right.
And so it can be frustrating where you're trying to help the most and you end up, you know, seeing people go through their biggest pain.
Right. And there's nothing like your family giving you that first experience in practicing family law.
Right.
Your family members always come to you to solve some type of child. That's where I learned how to do child support. With some of my family members.
Exactly.
Now, before we begin our discussion, we're going to get specifically into the process of divorce and how a person can best navigate that system and come out on the other side in a healthy relationship. We're going to have a quick global discussion about divorce and our perceptions that we have in society. We'll start with you, Dianne. I'm going to call you Dianne if you don't mind.
Please do.
Do you think that perhaps the Hollywood persona of divorce that we have, we see Tiger Woods on TV, the Brad and Jennifer Aniston, Jennifer Lopez divorced many times, Demi Moore, and of course there's nobody more associated with divorce more than Elizabeth Taylor. When we see these figures go through the process and we don't really get a chance to see the behind the scenes that happens, the alienation, the feeling that you've have not been successful in something. Do you think perhaps Hollywood gives people a false persona of that process of divorce?
Well, I think they do. I think one of the reasons you mentioned those is because it was a lot of litigation. And you see, you don't see the, like you said, the back part of that. Where are their children through this process? You know, what about family members? What about friends? And so all you see is those two Hollywood stars who are good at pretending, pretend that things are okay. And as you both have mentioned, for many people, it is the most difficult thing they'll ever go through in their life. And so not seeing what it's really like and how it affects our children, extended family members, gives the impression that it's a quick, beneficial, okay thing to do. And the truth is, we know that the families are tremendously affected at every level, and it's difficult on our communities.
Right, you take someone like Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston. We saw that divorce. We did not get to see what that might have felt like for Jennifer Aniston, you know, being rejected and in a public way, but in a private way, how that might have affected her own self-esteem.
Oh, it's tremendous, and in fact, it's why I'm just ecstatic about what we do here in Denton County. I teach, I'm one of the providers that teach children caught in the middle. It's a family stabilization course, because in fact, what we forget sometimes as judges, attorneys, mediators, is that this is the first time they've ever gone through the process. And so we really have to get them at that baby level. And we're asking them to make financial decisions, but there's still all this emotion. And typically what we find is that one of the parties is further down the road emotionally than the other. And so when those things aren't addressed and taken care of, and again, looking to that particular divorce case, I'm sure both parties were experiencing a lot of emotion. And hopefully they were getting the help they needed. Now, in their particular case, there were no children, but it is a grief process. If you think about little girls, what do? We grow up with Sleeping Beauty and all Cinderella, and our guy comes, knight in shining armor comes and rescues us, and we live happily ever after. And that's not true. So a lot of women and men as well suffer emotionally, thinking it's the death of a dream, that this was going to last forever.
And we'll talk further down about those stabilization courses and the different emotional balance that two people may come into the process at. They may be already at a different level. Now, Denise, did you find in your practice or as a judge that people walk into this process with a false perception of what the divorce process is really like?
You know, I think we've kind of seen an evolution of what people expect from the divorce process. back when we did not have no-fault divorce, the idea of going to court usually involved blaming the other party for the fault in the breakup of the marriage, either for purposes of gaining a divorce, getting a disproportionate share of the estate, or getting currying favor with the judge for the purpose of getting custody of the kids. And so we had this perception or this idea in society that divorce was a war that needed to be fought in front of juries and with the biggest, baddest attorney.
Like War of the Roses, that movie.
Exactly. And what we've come to understand over time is that court isn't necessarily the best place to resolve most of these conflicts. And so we have developed tools to try and get us to the place where we don't have to fight these battles in court.
Okay.
And so we have, now we have mediation, which was introduced in the late 80s, early 90s. We developed into a model called collaborative law, where the parties agree they're never ever going to go to court, that they're going to resolve everything between themselves, that if for some reason they can't reach that agreement, that they fire their attorneys and they end up going to court, so that everybody, including the attorneys and the parties, have incentive to work it out rather than go to court and start from scratch.
Okay, well, let's talk. We're going to get specifically, because I could tell you guys are itching to get into the specifics of what you do and how we can best navigate the divorce process and perhaps map out for our viewers a better way to approach it so that we can have healthy families. That's what we want to try to accomplish today. Dianne, specifically, you being in the trenches, in terms of working with Seema, you are a counselor and you also are a mediator.
Yes.
And I'm a mediator, so I greatly respect what you do because you mediate extremely conflicted type of situations. Dr. Alan Swartz wrote an article about divorce. He had a training with some 9th grade students, and the training was really designed to be about how to resolve conflict. But in the midst of his training, he discovered that part of the greatest conflict that children have, or that they were having, was their divorcing parents and being caught in the middle of it. And he wrote, these students emphasized the fact that they felt extremely burdened by the types of problems their parents were reporting to them. In several cases, it was reported that each of the divorced parents tried to propagandize them against the other parent so that they felt caught in the middle of their ongoing conflict. Dianne, how often do you deal with these types of issues with parents trying to bring their children into the process?
Oh, I would say it's very often, and I think if we understand that they're going through this grief process, and certainly we all know what sexual incest is, but sometimes I see this as emotional incest. Mom or dad are really having a difficult time emotionally. They're not getting professional help. And so they kind of use the children to kind of help them feel better about what's happening, and so they involve the children. And many of the children that I interview, whether it be the courts ask me to see them or for mediation, you can ask the children, whose responsibility is it to make the parents happy, and they will say it's theirs. So what happens is you have children that are trying to please mom. They want mom to be happy, they want dad to be happy, and so in the middle they lose who they are. And you have these amazing children that learn that the only good survival is to lie about their feelings about the other parent. They learn early they can't talk to the other parent about a parent. And so these children are tremendously conflicted. And if they're not addressed, they will go through life in this survival mode, and it's a lose-lose. So I'm so happy that the courts have recognized that we need to educate the parents as to what the children are going through, and then allow the children to be able to express that to their parents.
Right, and a lot of that will come out of those family stabilization things as well, and we'll get to that. Dennise, as a judge, when you see that happening in a case, how do you respond to that?
You have to be very careful about the way you respond to a child's perspective in a divorce. The Family Code obviously says at a certain age, it's mandatory that we consult with the children. And so this is another area where we've come into some sort of evolution about the child's voice in a case. Obviously, if a child's too young to understand what's best in any given situation, you can't really do everything that they want to do, because sometimes they're just saying, what they think you want to hear. Sometimes they're saying the thing that the parent that they identify with most wants them to say. And sometimes they have very strong opinions about their situation, and that's why it's important to hear their voice in those situations in cases where there's abuse, where they're saying, I can't live in this household because of the abuse, or emotional or otherwise. So you can't completely ignore a child's voice, but you have to understand the child's voice in context.
Right.
The child's age, what their situation is, and some kids, a 12-year-old sometimes can be a very mature 12, sometimes it can be a very immature 12-year-old.
And at 12, in Texas, children are at least allowed to give their opinion, and a lot of parents seem to think that means that the child can actually choose which parent they're going to live with, but that's actually not the case, though, is it? They can kind of let the court know what their preference may be if that's how the attorneys and the parents want to present that to you.
Right.
But you don't go by what the child says per se, do you?
At the age of 12, if it's an issue before the court, then it's mandatory. And I will interview children, and I start out with the proviso. Listen, if the 6-year-old wants to eat all of their Halloween candy in one night, I can hear the child wants that, and I can take that into consideration in any decision that I make as a parent. But I'm not going to give them everything they want.
Right.
And so when I'm talking to someone who's around 12 or 16, I use that example and I say, I have to make the decision's completely on my shoulders. I will take into account something that you say, but I have a lot of information that you don't know, that you can't know, or maybe you can't understand. And I will take into account what you've told me, but that's not going to be the deciding factor.
And that kind of takes the burden off of them for having to say that they're deciding which parent that they want to live with. Now, you mentioned earlier family stabilization, and that's something that Seema provides courses in that area. Tell the viewers, what is the family stabilization, and why do parties have to go to those?
Well, it became a pilot program years ago, and basically what we were finding was a couple of things. Originally it was set up so that the parents could understand what the children were going through, and thereby help the parents, educate the parents, the things that were affecting the children negatively, and what they could do based on their age, their maturity, as we've discussed. As things have progressed, and I think the courts had found that whether it was for kids' sake or any of the family stabilization courses, that families were coming out with better knowledge of how to handle their situation with the children. And then what we felt was important. It's important to focus on the children, but we also in our class focus on the parents. We recognize we're here to educate them. To be able to be a good parent, they need to look out for themselves as well. If they're tremendously stressed by the divorce or what's going on and they're not getting help, then they're only as good to those people that are counting on them, their children, as they are for themselves. So what we teach is you have to do what's good for you, take the time, go to counseling, so that what you give your children and all those people that are depending on you is a good, healthy. And we educate them a little bit about their options versus litigation versus mediation, collaborative law, access facilitation. Back in the days, we didn't have that. You just went to court, and that was so. It's now, educating them.
Today, those courses, when there's a dispute about custody, those courses are usually required in a divorce process. Is that correct?
It is. In fact, in Denton County, it's required of anyone going through a divorce, going through a modification, or anything with the parent-child relationship, because it's kind of the same experience. Even if it is a modification, it may not be the full-blown divorce, but kids will tell us that anytime their parents are in court, it's a huge stress on them.
Right. And after they finish the course, they'll get a certificate that typically they'll be required to file with the court, give to their attorney, which lets the court know that they've attended it and are at least that much more serious in terms of how they approach their conservator dispute.
That's correct, and the judges, I'm thrilled to say, take it very seriously. In fact, in cases that we've seen, if those parents do not provide that certificate, the judges ask them to leave and not come back until they have it. So it's really empowering to be able to work with the judges and us be on the same page as to what's in the best interest of these children.
Now, Dennise, when a person files for divorce, and I think pretty much in every county in Texas, when you immediately file, there'll be something attached to that file, that petition called a standing order. And that order becomes in effect without a hearing, and it automatically puts certain things in place. Tell us what that is and why is there a need for a standing order?
When you file for divorce in Texas, there's a 60-day waiting period before you can actually get the divorce. Excuse me. We find that divorces will often take longer than that 60-day period for people to find out what their property is, how to divide it. And in that interim period, they need some guiding rules about how we're going to live now. Very often, one of the parties is not aware that the divorce is going to be filed on the day that it's filed, or that they're even going to be served. And so what it serves as is a protection to keep the property the way it is, to not move the kids, to not change the insurance policies, because sometimes, someone who files for divorce, they're ready to be divorced that day. Mm-hmm. And so what they start to do without these guiding principles is to, okay, I'm going to switch out the insurance, I'm going to clean out the bank account, I'm going to transfer the kids here, I'm going to move here, I've decided I've moved on. Without some sort of intervention from the court, the other party, if you don't have these standing orders, the other party loses just by virtue of the fact that they're not prepared for it. They weren't aware that this was going to happen.
Now we filed our petition for divorce. We're under the standing orders. Let's go to the fun part, okay? Now, there's never a shortage of jokes about attorneys, right?
Right.
But there's also another side of it, and that's clients. And we have our concerns with clients as well. Now, you come from the perspective as a family law attorney as well as a family law judge. Let's talk about some of the things that people do that ruin their own cases, their behavior, either in court or mostly in court, and then we'll discuss some of the out-of-court things they do with Dianne.
Early on in a case, the feelings are all raw, and so people are very emotional in court. And at the very beginning of a case, you can kind of make a little bit of an exception for them and say, I understand this is new to you. But as you get into the case more and more, if the emotions remain raw and the parties show no signs of being able to disentangle from their conflict, you start to have concerns about their ability to parent together. And the biggest problem becomes that disentanglement, that inability to learn how to disentangle from the conflict and then to be able to move forward to parent their children. If there are no children, then eventually you can get to the place where we say this is just a property business-like transaction and divide the estate. But even in those cases, if they don't, you may start ending up into stalking behavior, protective order, behavior that you need to protect somebody from. And those are the kinds of things where people actively hurt themselves in their cases when they don't get to the place where they understand this is either an end of the relationship or a change in the relationship, and that they've got to adapt and evolve with that.
Okay. Now, Dianne, you probably deal with a lot of the out-of-court behavior, and you mentioned earlier about how important it is for a party in the midst of a divorce to take care of themselves, because you can't help someone else if you can't take care of yourself. What would be some steps you would tell a person who's in a high conflict divorce that they needed to do to behave correctly and help their own case?
Well, first of all, we have to understand a lot of what comes out is angered behavior. And so I think educating them that anger is a secondary emotion. We don't wake up one day and go, I'm going to be angry today. There's usually emotions behind that. And if you look at the major emotions behind anger, it's pain, fear, injustice, and all of those things are present during that time. So if we can educate them to understand, look, we know you're hurting. We know you're fearful of the process. We know in some parts of it you feel there's injustice, but let's deal with the emotions, and then let's look at the logics. And let's try and keep them separated. And I think that's the beauty of being able to do some things out of court, is that we can address the emotions and help them understand the process so that they feel more relieved about the process. Attorneys will send clients saying, I don't feel like they're emotional ready. Can you help them? Can you, or the kids, we need to bring them in. And that helps to prepare them for going to the judges.
I don't mean to cut you off, but we're going to have to go to what we call our closing statement.
Okay.
Okay. And I'm going to start with you.
Okay.
I'm going to let you provide a closing statement for a minute and tell the viewers anything that you would like to take with them to help create that map that they need to get through this process.
Well, again, I think it's important for them to take care of themselves. And the illustration I give them is, if they're in an airplane and the oxygen level changes, who gets the mask first, the child or the older adult? And 99% of the time they'll say the child or the older adult. And I say, no, you have to get it first. And so I think first recognizing that they are going through a very stressful situation and helping them select things that help them, whether it's counseling, running, exercise, different things that help them deal with their emotions. And then it's to also help them understand that they're very passionate about what they believe, but they have to also recognize that while they're going through this, their children are as well. And so what are they providing for their children that gives the children outlets? And the other thing is recognizing you're going to be in this relationship forever with this person, but it's going to be different. It's going to be a business relationship. You guys are in the business of raising good, healthy, productive children.
And that should be their paramount concern. Denise?
I think everything Dianne says is on point with regard to preparing yourself emotionally, mentally for the process. I'd say that the other element that I would add to that has to deal with getting professional help in the way of legal help. Very often people will come up representing themselves, and they'll say, how do I do this? And it's a question that I tell them, this isn't a question that you should ask an attorney. And the reason is your attorney has 3 years of law school, probably a few years of mentoring, and then a few years of experience in dealing with this. And there are probably 1,000 different ways or different things that you have to consider before you come up with an answer that's suitable to your case. You wouldn't attempt to give yourself an appendicitis.
No.
You shouldn't attempt to divorce yourself.
Right.
Unless you have absolutely no property and absolutely no risk of family violence and no children, then that might be the only time that you could that'd be more like taking a splinter out, right?
Right.
But most people don't have those situations, and they really do at least need to consult with someone about things they might be missing, even if they decide to move forward with
and that can't be stressed enough that you really need to go through that process with the correct people, an attorney as well as maybe a counselor if you need the process. Now we're at the point where I call my final argument that I get to make, ladies. No one wishes anyone to have to go through the divorce process. It is a terribly emotional time. Having practiced family law for several years, I've come to the conclusion that the people who get through the process the best and are able to maintain the healthiest relationships are those who remember that it's more important to love your children more than you hate your spouse. And keep that in mind, because the children will be dealing with the separation of the family for a lifetime, and it could be scarring to them having to go through the process with conflicting parents. I would like to thank my guests, the Honorable Dennise Garcia and the Honorable Dianne Costa. Not to be outdone in some of my circles, I too am honorable as a precinct chair, but I'm just throwing that in there. But I do thank you guys for coming today, and I would like to thank you both for the public service that you do for our community. We don't always appreciate the amount of responsibility public servants have and the pressures that they have. So I thank you both for doing that. For Access to Justice, I'm Delia Parker Mims. Thank you.